What you're watching is a ceremony called Last Post. This is the Belgian city of Ypres, one of the main places where the First World War was fought. And we're here on our First World War travel course that takes place every other J term. At 8 o'clock every night since the 1920s, except for World War II, Belgian firefighters have gathered, traffic has been stopped, and people watch the firefighters play Last Post, which was what was played in Allied and British lines at the end of each day. When the soldiers would be counted and those who are missing, we'd realize that they were dead. And so this, you'll see they're surrounded by the names of those who died in the war. It's a really moving ceremony, and just one thing from our trip we wanted to bring you this week on Past and Presents. Last Post takes place under what's called Meningate. Meningate was inaugurated in 1927, 9 years after the end of World War I, as a memorial to about 55,000 missing British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African Commonwealth soldiers who had fought in the battles of Ypres, defending the Allied positions outside the city, and were unidentified. It's designed by Sir Reginald Blomfield, who is one of the main war architects. You see his work all over the Western Front, including the Cross of Sacrifice that rises above every single British Commonwealth war cemetery. As the episode continues, we're going to take you to other sites around Ypres and around the Battle of the Somme, which was fought in 1916 by the British, French, and Germans. But let's start with our faculty conversation of the week. Well, students, welcome back to part 2 of a conversation that started last week between AnneMarie Kooistra and myself about how Christians engage in the practice of history. So to review from last week, was to a significant, I was going to say certain, but a significant extent, thinking historically and thinking Christianly about the past probably overlap a lot.
Yeah.
That, Christians are seeking truth, and I think using the rules of evidence that other historians use help us to get that truth. We started, though, to think about what difference faith would make, and talked about the way that the reality of sin or a belief in the Imago Dei would shape us. One way it could make it different that our friend George Marston suggested to dismiss is it could lead us to say, well, we view certain texts, for example, as having special authority. Christians believe in a set of Holy Scriptures as special revelation.
Yeah.
And you could, for example, write an article or a book in which you quote regularly from Scripture to support arguments you're making. You could. I mean, I've heard Mormon historians talk about the fact that that tradition has a deep sense of God revealing himself especially through continuing prophecy, Joseph Smith, all the way up through the church hierarchy of today. You could appeal to that. So Mormon historians wrestle with that. Why should we not do that? I mean, if you do regard, let's assume we regard Scripture as authoritative and inspired and having, I mean, it's important to us, right?
It's very important.
So why would we set that off to the side when we're doing this other really important thing to us of studying the past?
Well, I think on the first gut reaction I have is that part of what motivates me to do the kind of work I do is so that I can be part of the larger discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And in my particular field, I don't see it overrun with Christians. So as soon as I'm starting to use biblical texts, I am going to be out of that discussion and completely discounted, and that is not something I want to do. So that's a very pragmatic rationale.
Can we talk about that, this access to the academy?
But the second thing, too, it feels odd to use the Bible in writing a history, because the people I think of immediately are people like William Bradford, who coming to the shores of North America and seeing that, in fact, the Native American villages were decimated by disease, but they had left behind their corn and shelters. Mm-hmm. He saw this as an act of God. Mm-hmm. You know, clearly God's hand was at work, sweeping away the multitudes that he might make room for us. And I think I don't want to be in the position where 50 years from now, my grandchildren are looking back and going, wow, Grandma was really off in sort of suggesting that God's hand was evident in this or that fashion when, in fact, the facts do not seem to support that.
So this leads us really seamlessly into what FIA is mostly writing about this week, which is you could engage in a Christian practice of history, and frankly, a lot of Christian historians did this into the early 20th century, called providential history, where you are trying to read the hand of God at work, and you've got to balance a couple of things. So John suggests Christians have some sense, at least, of providence, that God is not this deistic watchmaker up, but he is actively engaged. The Holy Spirit is at work. The church is doing the work.
Absolutely.
And yet, he says that in almost all settings, it would be inappropriate for a Christian historian to come to the interpretation you just described.
Well, and I think, too, it's also a matter of realizing that, Christians are fallen, the church is fallen, and God doesn't just work in obvious ways. Sometimes God works, I believe, through tragedy. And, to be able to say with complete clarity that, this is evidence that God is working versus this, I think God is working through everything. So to say this has some sort of special evidence versus that seems to discount then the other part of the history.
It often seems like the judgment of God in those interpretations lines really closely with personal sense. Your own worldview. I think if we haven't talked about the virtue of humility yet in history, this maybe is a good point to start. And this is, I think, one of John's responses. It's a profoundly unhumble way of approaching the past.
And I think it takes a lot of chutzpah on the part of a historian to be able to say, I have probed the mystery of an omniscient and omnipotent God, and I can clearly tell you what is happening here. I think you're displacing God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit there, and I think that's not a position I certainly want to be in.
Okay, let me give you a third distinctively Christian way. That this might be a little trickier, but we've talked about a conviction about the reality of sin might be a kind of control belief that would shape how we do history. Wouldn't that then lead us occasionally to want to engage in moral judgment? If history is this act of interpretation, it's not just facts, we're actually making meaning of them. Aren't there moments where, for example, as a 20th century U.S. historian, you approach the treatment of Asian Americans in California, the treatment of African Americans in the Jim Crow system? Is it wrong for you to make a moral judgment at some point rather than just describing or analyzing?
It's not wrong to make a moral judgment because, again, I think historians are just doing that. Again, it's part of the interpretation. And I think there are times when, again, though, it's important to be aware of your present bias and why you're seeing that as a moral judgment. And knowing, and to go back to the humility thing, knowing that very possibly you will be judged in 30 years as being, whoa, you were able to see that Jim Crow was a bad thing and that maybe the 1950s civil rights movement moved along too slowly. But you also have to be aware that, you've got those logs in your own eye. And I think even as you're making the moral judgments, it's really important to do that with a sense of humility that you're not understanding the complete situation at the time. One of the things with regard to civil rights, you've got some really great people out there pushing for more immediate end to various terrible practices. But it's really important to tell students, the reason that the older generation is cautious is because they're afraid their kid's going to get killed. And so, don't judge the more gradualist folks too harshly without understanding, too, that it's important to get into their shoes and see things from their perspective as well.
Right. So not just humility, but desire for empathy might drive us towards
Indeed.
that kind of
It's
caution.
very important.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it offers a unique perspective on American history. Many students are at least somewhat familiar with the storyline, the narrative of American history, but they haven't gone on that journey from the perspective of a particular group of people. Students can really engage in these women's lives and see a lot of, I think, of themselves. That here's a woman who lived a long time ago, but yet she's experiencing some of the same emotions or fears or challenges that I face in the 21st century. Jade Snow Wong is a woman that I really, really resonate with. I have nothing in common with her, but I just love her story and how she tells her story. Her story is Fifth Chinese Daughter, and it's an autobiography of growing up in California in the 1930s and 40s. And she is one of 9 children, but she's the 5th daughter. And that's how she's referred to. She's the 5th daughter in the family and her quest for education. And so it really is something as students we can explore, what kind of drive do you have for your education? And many of these women, they're struggling with personhood and identity and education and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be an American. So lots of things that you can grab onto. It's also really empowering to be a part of these women's lives for a semester. So I would encourage students to take the course.
We're just outside of Ypres in a small town called Langemarck. This is the site of one of the German military cemeteries in Belgium. About 44,000 German soldiers lie buried here, including about 7,000 whose remains are unidentified. Behind me you see a mass grave. In front of it is an inscription from the book of Isaiah. It says, "I have called you by name and you were mine." It's a really fascinating cemetery. Just to get in here, you cross over a moat, and it's meant to evoke crossing the river Styx of Greek mythology and descending to the dead. Notice that it's not much rises up from the ground. The gravestones are all flat. They're not headstones or crosses. They each have multiple names, or it says 4 unidentified German soldiers. The clusters of 3 volcanic crosses were added, I believe, after World War II. I'm staring actually at the one thing that was allowed to rise up above the horizon, a collection of 4 statues who are very abstract features. One represents the medics. He's not armed, and they're looking out over their fallen comrades. It's really a powerful place to visit, and just one of the hundreds of cemeteries in this part of Belgium and into northern France.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I'm Micayla Moore. I'm a senior. I'm a double major in social studies ed and history, and then I'm a Spanish minor. Graduating in the spring, and AnneMarie Kooistra's TA.
I'm Julie Muckenhirn, and I am a senior here, history major, and I'm a TA for Professor Amy Poppinga.
Well, it's kind of a natural choice for me. I've always been really interested in history. My mom was a social studies teacher in my hometown and kind of cultivated that interest in me really young. And I knew I wanted to go into social studies ed, so history just kind of seemed like a natural tack on. So that was originally why I had chosen it. And once I had taken a couple classes, I knew that it was something I wanted to stick with. Just the emphasis on reading and writing, incorporation of sources, I just saw it as something so complementary to my education major and like very mutually enriching kind of path both ways.
It was a little bit of a long process for me. I did 1 year at Bethany Lutheran College in Mankato and kind of finished out my generals and was a little bit unsure what I wanted to pursue next. So I took some time off to work full-time actually and decided to come to Bethel. And just realized I was just very interested in history, and that had been consistent throughout all my schooling years. And it was something I continued to have a passion for. And after talking to some professors in the department and getting to know Bethel's history department, I really decided to pursue that ultimately.
I remember after taking CWC, I think I was like recommended for it or something, but I was like, I don't even know what that means. Like, what does that look like to be a TA? So I did pursue it that year also because I had a pretty full plate. But then I took History of Sexuality in the U.S. with Dr. Kooistra, or Professor Kooistra, in the spring of my sophomore year, I believe. Yeah, that was the first time that class was offered. And I had never taken a class from her before, but we really connected, and I loved her teaching style. And she actually had mentioned it to me if I'd ever considered being a TA. And so that's how it kind of got brought up again for me, where I really started to consider it seriously.
As a transfer, get to know the department and kind of what they did and the professors better, so I felt that it would be a good way to learn more about that. But then also, on another level, just to really develop myself as a history major, to see, what other students are involved and kind of what that process looks like.
Like, yeah, this is something I really want to do, just to be more connected with the department and to just get involved more in conversations and see what that work looks like. and how that would benefit me both for my ed major and my history major.
So what does that work look like? What do you do for AnneMarie?
Okay. So I do a little bit of everything. Like some days I am like the library jockey, and you just like run to the library and you grab some books, or you find her daughter's Valentine that she accidentally left in a book that she had returned. So some days it's fun missions like that. But no, more of the work is, just looking at course materials, having conversations with her about, what's working and what's not, and what maybe can I change, what does this look like? And then more logistical things like grading quizzes, which is something I'll have to do as a teacher and have done as a teacher, so that's always good too, getting that good practice.
It's a lot of grading quizzes and, short essay, that kind of stuff, and returning stuff to POs. Odd jobs that she may have for me.
A lot of the work is conversations that happen, actually more so than the logistical, grading work. But those are the things that I find the most beneficial probably, are those conversations about, okay, how is this class going? Like, what do you think about this assignment? Like, how can we make this better? Or, like, what's your input on this? And those are the things that I like to kind of engage in the most, because I know that my professors care about the stuff that they're delivering, and they're critically engaging, like, okay, how are students receiving this? And then for me and my own purposes, like, when I become an educator, I want to have that same mindset, like, okay, how are students responding to this? How can I improve this assignment? Like, does this make sense? Always looking to kind of improve.
I think number one, just getting to know the department better has been really, really helpful and really awesome. Getting to know the professors personally and kind of what they're looking for and expertise that they may have. That has been huge for me, again, as a transfer. And then just getting to know the other students, especially the other TAs, has been a lot of fun and really helpful, and kind of to continue spurring on that passion.
One of the things I'm most excited about in teaching the modern Middle East is the fact that in order for it to be modern, we have to really be focused on current events. That I want students to recognize that history is a living, breathing thing, that not only are they a part of it, but that it's being shaped all of the time. So particularly with the study of the Middle East, this is what's dominating current events every day. Kemal Ataturk is a fascinating figure that actually kind of serves as a his story provides this broader narrative to really even understanding the struggles of creating a modern Middle East and how the Middle East interacts with the rest of a global society. At the same time, it's fascinating to look at, and we will do this, things like the Iraqi national soccer team, the Iranian national soccer team. So I think that sports is such a huge part of Middle Eastern history and part of national identity, and understanding things like religious divides, understanding gender inequity, and also places where gender boundaries really get pushed, which is a huge theme in the course. So as much as I'm excited to focus on sort of big figures, I'm also excited for us to really actually be following soccer teams and cricket teams and things like that, to sort of see how those both unite and then also divide people, but how they're representative of a lot of these other societal issues.
All this mess I'm swimming in, but pain is not.
So we've moved on to northern France. We're near a river called the Somme, which was the site of one of the worst battles of World War I. On July 1st, 1916, British and Commonwealth troops went over the top and attacked German positions. By the end of the day, 20,000 were dead and twice as many were wounded. And the battle continued until November. We're standing in preserved trenches. You see that these wouldn't have been good for someone who's 6'3". The average soldier was about 5.5 feet at the time. If you look down over the whole system, you see how complicated it is, and you'll see no man's land. There's a British battlefield cemetery off to my left. About 400 meters away was the target, the German trenches by the tree line, and you see a Scottish statue down there, a Highlander. That's where the British finally reached their position in November of 1916, and then winter halted the battle. And in 1918, they lost it all again.
So, AnneMarie, let me pick up from the theme of moral judgment and give you something I've at least heard Tracy McKenzie say, and I can't remember if he talks about in First Thanksgiving. He suggests moral judgment in the sense of you got some kind of authority as a historian then to issue a ruling on something be in or out of moral bounds. That maybe is something to be cautious about, but one thing we shouldn't be too hesitant to engage in is what he calls moral reflection. Mm-hmm. That rather than using the vantage point of the historian to issue a judgment on a group of people for their moral blind spots, maybe it causes you to use history as a mirror and to think about where your own shortcomings. Is that something you're maybe a little bit more comfortable with? Do you see
I'm
problems
probably
with
more
that
comfortable.
As well?
I think that's probably all right. And I think especially, again, as I think about, we still deal with problems of prostitution and vice and how to regulate crime or how to, deal with criminals. And I think understanding the conditions that made prostitution prevalent in the late 19th century and then looking at what has changed, what's the same, to what degree are we not just dealing with this group of people, but to what degree am I implicated in these things? I think that is a good thing to think about. Same with civil rights, same with any of these things.
Yeah, and I think it maybe then leads us to our final topic, which is the purpose of us engaging in history, especially at a place like this, is not simply to produce books and articles, but it's a teaching calling, and it's a learning calling for students, and we'll say more about calling at the end of this webisode series. And it gets us to one of John Fia's arguments, is that the purpose of history is, in part, personal, right?
Yeah.
It actually produces some effect. Like studying the past within this discipline actually shapes you and informs you. It makes you more humble, we've talked about.
Right.
It might make you more loving of neighbors, possibly. So even suggests it could be conversional.
Yeah.
It could bring about some significant changes. And at Bethel, we talked about transformative education. Right. Is that overreaching? I mean, do you see this happening? Is conversional too strong a word to use here?
I think that if you understand conversion as a process, I think that works. I don't think you can understand it as it's going to be something that happens overnight. Maybe for some people it will, but I think it's it's the slow burn. It's the slow burn where something is simmering and something is moving and it's causing you to think differently, but it's not going to happen just in a split second. It's going to happen with each successive class. It's going to happen with each successive book or article that you read, and you're going to be going, this is, I used to think this, but I'm wondering if I'm thinking something else now, and it has this impact on even how I see myself.
I think we have to approach, at least as professors, developmentally too.
Yeah.
I think I guess I expect to see this happening more in junior and senior level courses. It's a really difficult thing to do when you're 18 and it's your first time you're being asked to empathize deeply with people you might consider horrific in some respect. But I think empathy is really important here, because if you really take it seriously, you're leaving yourself open to connecting, entering with the mind of someone who views the world very differently from yourself. And one thing that Fia wrestles with is, can you do that if you don't leave open the possibility you will turn, you will change, you'll be converted as a result of it?
And I, as I've said to my students, even in a class last week, I said, the thing is, there is a sense sometimes of futility because, everybody's going to just stay the same. But the thing is, learning history does make you aware of, while there's a lot of resistance to change, even as Christians, you have to believe that people can change, because that's the third part of the creation fall redemption paradigm. Redemption implies that people, in fact, can change. Right. So I think, your world kind of comes crashing down on you when you are exposed to certain subjects, but then you do that with the hope of later transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think if change over time is one of those kind of staples of historical thinking, it should suggest, not to say everything needs to change, but you should be open to it and sensitive to the ways that this has happened in the church. It's happened beyond the church. Yeah.
And, change can happen when you ask questions, when you are willing, through empathy, to stand in somebody else's shoes. And it's much easier to do that when you're actually reading the words from the people themselves or seeing the world as they photographed it. And I think that's why history is such this beautiful tool of connection.
So we're agreed. History is awesome.
Yes,
our work here is done.
Indeed.
We've moved a few kilometers down the Western Front. We're still on the former battleground of the Somme, and this is the great British memorial to the missing of the Somme outside the tiny village of Thiepval, designed by Sir Edward Lutyens, who's also the designer of the Cenotaph, which is the memorial right by 10 Downing Street in the House of Parliament that we visit very early in the trip. Something like 70,000 names are inscribed here, and then there's a small cemetery on the other side with 300 French and 300 British buried as well. It's really a monumental site. This really dwarfs Menin Gate, which is where we started this episode. Thanks for joining us on this little snippet of our World War I tour. If you're interested in the class, it'll be going again in January of 2017. In any case, we'll see you next week on Past and Presents.
Back, baby, back in time. Wanna go back when you were mine. Back, baby, back in time.